now we're going to talk about physical intimacy, and just in my own honesty, this is the one that I probably developed the least and have the least information on.
I think that is really funny when you say that, because you are a trained sex therapist.
Yes.
I mean, that you have classes about that in your master's degree. You've worked on that with couples for years. So, but you mean as a structured fundamental tool you've thought about the least?
Yes, that's what I mean. Of these fundamental tools that
so that's
of how
very
I've thought
interesting
about
to me.
it.
I think it's also interesting that you placed it fourth. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of men especially, but just people in general, who would think, well, that is the primary fundamental of a healthy marriage is a good physical relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it below the other three we've already talked about?
Because you can't have a happy, healthy physical relationship with somebody that you're not romantically and friendshiply and charitably in love with. It's not going to work long term.
So
I mean, you
those
might be able to
other
short term do that, but long term you're not going to have that.
So those other things build into having your physical relationship be a complete thing, rather than being something where you feel like you are using each other to satisfy your physical desires.
Yes, that's a big part of it, is that you can't be fulfillment in a physical relationship requires those other things as predecessors. Without that, you can have sex and it might feel good, but it's not going to create the bonding that is needed for a healthy relationship.
Yeah, it creates some level of bonding.
Oh, it creates a tremendous level of bonding. But if you don't have the other bonding already in place, then it's an unhealthy bonding.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's why people who have sex outside of marriage are creating a tremendous amount of bonding. It's just unhealthy. Yeah. And even in marriage, you really need to have these other bonds developed, because that physical bonding with a sexual relationship, it not only does it bond you together as a couple, but it takes those other bonds and pulls them together and creates a whole bonding process. And if you're bonding together without those other loves, then you're bonding nothing.
It's an interesting way of thinking of it.
It's an empty bonding.
So you've had couples come to you who say their marriage is good, all except that they never have sex. And you've had couples come to you who say, our marriage is terrible, but we have great sex all the time. Yep. You've had both sorts of things. And I just bring that up because a lot of people tend to think that if their sexual experience is frequent and mutually satisfying, that they will have a good marriage.
Well, it is true that sex is the best single indicator of a good or bad relationship, marital relationship.
So, so let's say a couple comes into you to talk to you, and you ask them about how their sexual life is going. What's the parameters? Like, what's the range that you're looking for to think, okay, that's a good sign for this relationship?
Oh, wow, that's a hard question. Yeah, range.
It's not once a month.
Oh, you're talking about how frequently?
Well, I mean, it could be frequency. It could be other things too.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. Now, frequency is something that we'll talk about in a little bit, because that's one of the rules of intimacy, is the frequency that you're having
okay,
sex.
So some of the things that so you say that it's an indicator of a healthy marriage. what are the parts of that? Frequency is a part of it. Being
Frequency
indicator.
is
What else?
frequency is a part of it. Satisfaction is a part of it. How satisfied are is each person when they're coming out of that sexual, interaction. Those are the two primary things.
The primary things are
Are
frequency, and,
frequency
satisfaction.
and satisfaction. The third thing is actually a result of the frequency and the primary and the satisfaction, and that is there residual resentment focused around the sexual intimacy, and resentment can come from either side. Either you're having it too much, or you're not having it enough, or you're having it but you're not being satisfied. Any of those could lead to a physical resentment, and the physical
and probably
resentment
also
is
resentment that's around people's, and this isn't sex directly, but around how they feel about their partner's relationship to other sexual things. That could be pornography, it could be lustful behavior in general, like the kind of stereotypical thing of the husband who checks out other women when
but
they're out.
those will go into also these other things we've talked about, because usually if one of the
So usually if the frequency and satisfaction are really good on both sides, you're not having those other problems.
you're not usually having those problems, and when you are having those problems, almost always there's a problem with frequency and satisfaction, both.
Okay.
And oftentimes, if somebody's looking at pornography, whether it's a man or a woman, and women are just as likely to look at pornography today as men are, but if somebody's looking at pornography, they're likely creating a higher sex drive than they would naturally have, which means they're desiring more sex than is naturally
And isn't
healthy.
it also true that sometimes that they have the opposite effect, where they have less desire for sex with their partner because they're
No.
That's what I've just been hearing this stuff about how the pornography epidemic leads to lower sex drive
I've
or
never
lower
seen.
sexual performance.
I've never seen that. What it does lead to is lower satisfaction in sexual intercourse.
Yeah.
So the person who is addicted to pornography is desiring to do things for their own satisfaction, and therefore are not satisfying their partners.
Yeah, makes them selfish.
It makes them very selfish. From my experience, no, it doesn't diminish the sex drive at all. In fact, it increases it exponentially. What I have noticed, what does decrease sex drive, there's a lot of research that suggests this, is feelings of transgenderism.
Okay.
That lowers sex drive tremendously.
So issues with your own gender and sexuality.
Your own gender identity. If you're not,
Yeah, I said sexuality, but it's specifically gender.
yeah, it's
identity.
gender identity, and that's why you'll find that a lot of people who identify as transgender or as non-binary or as these other gender identities, they oftentimes also consider themselves asexual because they don't have that sex drive. And so that is very true. And if those people are engaged in pornography or anything like that, that probably is minimized. That probably amplifies the minimization. But then you're talking about two separate things.
Okay, so when we're talking about issues like this, those are issues that you need to seek professional help. These are not things that come under the purview of a course like this. Yes.
No, exactly, they're not. And if pornography is involved in your relationship, you need to go get help to overcome the pornography addiction. If you're having issues with gender identity
Or
sexual identity, again, that's not something that we're talking about. We're talking to married couples who are trying to have a healthy marriage relationship.
Okay.
So those issues are issues to be dealt with in a different setting, in a different format.
Okay, so what are your principles then of healthy marital intimacy?
Well, let's talk about frequency first, because that's the first thing that usually comes up.
Yeah, I think it comes up in almost everyone's mind first.
Yeah.
Like,
so a lot of so you have to ask yourself, what is a healthy frequency of sexual of intercourse in your marriage, in your relationship? And I'll tell you right now that the vast majority of people are not healthy in this. They're the average married couple is having sex about once every 2 weeks.
what?
That is the average.
That
The
seems
average
crazy
the
to
average
me.
couple who are cohabiting, like they are together, but they're not married, are having
Mhm.
sex about once a month.
That seems odd to me.
and couples and people who are not married and are not together with somebody are having sex even less frequently than that. Which is weird, because our society makes it sound like people are having sex all the time, that they're always out there having sex. And because we are a highly sexualized society, but that doesn't mean that everybody's out there having sex all the time.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay, so I can tell by the way you're saying this that you would say once every 2 weeks is too low.
Way too low.
Do you have a frequency that's too much?
Yes. So the ideal would be 2 to 3 times a week. That's ideal. More than 3 times a week, usually. So what happens is each person's body has a different sex drive. An amount of sex that you can have, that your body will, that sex will be pleasurable to you. When you exceed that energy, sexual energy potential, then sex is not only not pleasurable, but it's either painful or it at least has a very negative.
Yeah, it creates
feeling.
feelings of resentment, sometimes repulsion.
Yes.
It
Mhm.
acts against the bonding that you're
Right.
supposed to be doing.
Right. So the problem is, if you're having sex more than 3 times a week, you're almost certainly
Burning out one of the
burning
partners.
out one of the partners. If you're having sex less than 2 times a week, then one of the partners is not getting satisfied. Their sex drive is not getting satisfied, and they're building up a resentment because their body is building has
So
a
you're
desire.
saying that that level works even though there are unequal sex drives between
Yes.
partners, inevitably, that it's almost always a good compromise place.
And there's always, I don't care how good your sex life is.
There's
you'll
a
never
high desire
convince me.
partner and a low desire partner.
There's always a high desire partner, and there's always a low desire partner, and there's always disappointment. But disappointment does not have to lead to resentment. But that's the way to keep it from leading to resentment, is to keep your sexual encounters in a healthy range.
Now, just devil's advocate here. Would you say that there are periods where a greater frequency might be appropriate? For instance, say a newlywed period, or maybe you're going to have you might have short periods where
you have to be really careful with that, just saying that openly, because there are people
who are going to take advantage.
Who either will take advantage, or there are people who are going to think, well, I'm a newlywed, I should want to have sex more than twice a week, and their body is not there. And so if you say, yeah, newlyweds, oh no, wait a minute, there's going to be some who are not capable of that.
I'm just saying, let's say you have a newlywed couple come in and you ask them, how often are you having sex? And they say every day. You aren't going to think, oh, that's a sign that something's wrong.
No. And the other thing is, you have to, we're giving an ideal. And if I'm working with an individual couple, then I'm going to tailor what I do with them.
I guess the
to
point
them.
that I'm making is that this is, instead of being like, this is an every week thing, this is an average over time thing.
Yes, it's an average over. If you take 52 weeks in the year and you average it out, you should be averaging somewhere between 2 and 3 times a week. That means some weeks you won't be having sex because maybe you're on your period and you're not comfortable with that. Okay, that week you're not going to have sex. Well, the week before that, maybe you were feeling really into it and you had sex 4 times. Okay, those 2 weeks average out to 2 times. That's fine. Yeah,
that's all I was trying to bring up. The point
yes,
is that there is an ebb and flow to the natural desire level in a relationship, because people hear 2 to 3 weeks structured and they think that takes the spontaneity out, it takes the romance out, it takes the excitement out. And
no, but it doesn't. That's people have this crazy idea that if you schedule sex, that is boring. Why is it boring? Because it's scheduled. That's ridiculous. There's nothing boring about. So that's all hogwash. And I do have couples who say, "Oh, but you're going to take the spontaneity out of it." It's not about the spontaneity of sex. There's nothing that is actually spontaneous about sex, anyways. It's not a spontaneous thing. You have to get in the mood for it. You have to
go through predictable arousal phases.
Yeah, I mean, sex is not an unpredictable thing. I mean, there might be moments where you have a desire for sex when it's not an appropriate time. That's not unpredictable either. I mean,
there's a great part in C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, and if you haven't read that book, it's super awesome. But the section on eros, or sexual love, is really great, and he has this part about, well, okay, so eros is the romantic love, and then he differentiates between eros, romantic love, and Aphrodite, which would be sexual desire.
Right.
And that is kind of how we were differentiating when we were talking about romance in date night versus passionate love and physical intimacy. And he talks about how the Greeks called Aphrodite laughter loving Aphrodite. And he talks about how sexual desire just makes a fool of you all the time. Like, and he gives an example, like you're at a formal banquet where even just exchanging longing glances with your partner is really outside of the bonds of propriety, and Aphrodite's just hitting you so hard, and then you get the banquet's over and you go home and it's gone for both of you. She's left you both behind, and he says all you have to do, you just have to laugh at it. You just have to laugh at how fickle these physical feelings are.
And they are fickle, but they're also actually can be pretty predictable.
Anyway,
but here's the thing.
The point being is that you're going to have these. You have this arousal that comes and goes at different times, and you have to be able to cope with, I feel aroused and I can't do anything about it. And I don't feel aroused now, but my partner would like to be romantic. What am I going to do about that?
Well, and that's why you have a date night, because you create the tension that creates the template for triggering the arousal. That's what you're doing with a date night. It's not. You don't. There's nothing unpredictable about. Again, there's nothing unpredictable about sex and a sex drive and a desire. I mean, it's obvious. It's clear. So this whole thing about spontaneity is all stupidity. There is no such thing as spontaneous sex. It's not like all of a sudden you're laying in bed together naked spontaneously. There was nothing spontaneous about that. You had to take your clothes off. You had to do something to get to that point. There's no spontaneous sex. You can get that out of your head right now. No such thing as spontaneous sex.
Okay, I can tell you're very passionate about this.
I am.
So, all right. So we've talked.
So two to three
about
times.
Frequency, and would you say at least one of those times should definitely be scheduled with your date night?
Yes, at least one of those times, and maybe both, maybe two of the 3 times.
If you're not just regularly having that second or third time in a week, you might need to make sure you schedule in a second time.
Yes. So 2 to 3 times. Here's the other thing that's really important about sexual encounters with your spouse is that you need to make sure that you are discovering what is pleasurable to your spouse. What makes that encounter enjoyable to them and helps them feel fulfilled by the time you guys are done with the encounter. That is a part of the fun of sex. It's discovery. It's finding what is pleasurable. And then when you're in those moments, at least if you're having sex twice a week, at least one of those times, you should be concentrated on your spouse's enjoyment and not as much on your own. And that should be your focus. I'm focused on helping my spouse have a really good experience. And what I find oftentimes when I'm working with couples is that oftentimes there's one who is the
taker
aggressor,
and one who's the giver.
Yeah, and the giver oftentimes feels resentful
and
used, and the taker almost always feels dissatisfied because they aren't getting enough. They want more. Whatever it is they're getting, it's not enough. It's because they're not focusing on their spouse, they're focusing on themselves. And as long as you're focused on yourself, you are never going to have enough. And it goes back to what you were talking about earlier in one of the previous lessons that we did, where we have to lose ourselves in the sexual encounter with our spouse, and then we will find the joy of that relationship, of that sexual relationship.
Well, you were talking about how you have to discover what is pleasurable to your spouse. I think it's also important to remember that is going to vary from day to day, and something that you feel a desire for right now, you might not have that same desire the next time. So you have to there's a lot of communication that has to go on. A lot of it can be nonverbal. It doesn't all have to be verbal, but there has to be really good communication.
But that's a part of the fun. That's kind of what I was saying. Part of the fun of having sex is the discovery. If you found out that this is the formula of what they like, it would get boring pretty darn fast. It's much better that each time that you're having sex, you're discovering. Each time you're finding out what is it that's making my spouse feel the joy and pleasure of this moment.
There's one more rule that I know that you have, which has to do with fantasizing.
Oh, yes.
And this is something that is not what is generally taught about sex in marriage therapy. Do you want to kind of go into that?
Sure. I mean, it's simple. You should never have anybody else on your mind when you're having sex with your spouse.
Which includes an imaginary character that your spouse is pretending to be.
Correct. Your spouse, you should never pretend to be somebody else, and your spouse should never pretend to be somebody else. Your focus should be on your spouse and who they are. That's really important, and that's one of the reasons that I think pornography is so bad, because pornography very often leads people to imagining when they're having sex with their spouse that they're having sex with this person that they were watching or that person that they were watching. Is very dangerous. I actually think with a lot of the work I've done with sex therapy, I find a lot of just celebrities getting
people fantasize
about celebrities, and I think it's an extremely dangerous practice to allow your mind to wander to somebody else's body. And the Lord, even Jesus Christ, told us, what's the scripture? What did he say?
It says, if a man looketh on a woman to lust after her, he hath committed adultery in his heart.
So if you're imagining somebody else's body while you're having sex with your spouse, you've committed adultery according to what Jesus Christ says. So that's a huge rule. That's a super important rule that needs to
Now,
be
it doesn't
followed.
mean that there can't be any kind of fantasizing or fun within a sexual relationship. Things like lingerie can be really fun, the kind of fantasizing where you're like, we're imagining that we're in this exotic location, or we have, kind of
Right,
like
those are all
things,
fun.
as long as they're focused on your actual partner and the fantasy doesn't bring any other person into it.
Right.
So, not saying don't be adventurous in terms of imaginary things with your partner, in terms of positioning, in terms of all kinds of things that you guys can do together to like you say, discover things that are new and pleasurable. But don't try to alleviate boredom by bringing in outside people in any form.
Right. So that's another. There's one other rule that I want to bring up that I think is really important, and that is, after you've had sex, it is essential that you thank your spouse for the encounter and for the time. You should never go away from a sexual encounter with your spouse without thanking them for the time and effort that they put into that.
One of the things I really like about that rule is that if you know you're going to have to say thank you, you're going to do a couple of things that are really important. One is you're going to have to pay attention to what your spouse is doing for you. And two is you're going to have to communicate what you want so that you're able to feel satisfied and grateful. If you don't if you're like, oh, I'm gonna just not I'm just gonna ignore that I'm not really enjoying this and pretend that I'm enjoying it, then it's really hard to express thankfulness and gratitude. And if you know that you're going to be doing that, it's much harder for you to just pretend about what experience you're having and to ignore things that are not going right.
So that's important. Now, one other thing I just want to mention is,
okay, and after this last thing, then we're going to have a homework assignment. Sex
is not the only form of intimacy that you can have with your spouse. So, and it may be that for some reason or other you can't have sex in a given moment, but you can still be physically intimate. And so think about it. When we talk about physical intimacy, this is in all sorts of forms. It can be just a hug or a kiss. It can be laying in bed together, cuddled up, watching a show. It can be
different types of touch and massage.
Yeah,
and other parts of your body.
You just have to remember, physical touch. That's really what we're talking about. Is an intimate physical touch.
And it's not always going to include intercourse.
Right. And that's all. I just wanted to bring that up and make sure that everybody's aware. It does not require intercourse. It can be all sorts of different ways of engaging with your spouse. Now, we're going to give you an assignment, and the assignment that I want to give is, I want you, the next time that you are having sex with your spouse, I want you to think about what makes this a pleasurable experience for them. And even you can ask them if you want to. You can do some exploration, but that's my assignment. I want you to find out what is it that makes it pleasurable for your spouse to be in that physical, intimate relationship with you.
Okay. We're almost ready for our last fundamental, which will be compliments.